Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the UH Hilo TCVS seminar series. I'm Trina Henry, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rosie ʻAnolani Alegado. Dr. Alegado got her bachelor's in biology and minor in environmental health and toxicology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and her PhD in microbiology and immunology at Stanford University of Medicine. Today, she is an associate professor of oceanography and Hawaii Sea Grant at UH Mānoa, where she is also the director for the Sea Grant's Ulana ʻIke Center of Excellence. And she is also an investigator at the Daniel K. Inouye Center of Microbial Oceanography, Research and Education. But it's not only her professional achievements that make her special. Dr. Alegado is also an advocate for Indigenous data sovereignty and is deeply committed to increasing participation of underrepresented communities in STEM through positive partnership founded in mutual respect. Today, she's going to be sharing her work and insights about data sovereignty and data ethics in conservation-based and community-focused research. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Rosie ʻAnolani Alegado.
Aloha mai kākou. So thankful for being invited here to speak to you all today. I am going to share my slides and I am asking, this worked the last time. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, can you see a blank screen, like a black screen? Let me know if you can. If you can, that's perfect. Can I get some? Okay, perfect. Okay. So, you know, it's been pretty popular lately for some people to do land acknowledgements. And instead of a typical land acknowledgement, I wanted to share with you my mo'okuauhau, my genealogy, which weaves together all of my ancestors and the places that they come from. Well, actually just one thread of my tree, one root of my tree. And so you have an idea of all of the places that really shaped who I am today. So, o Louisa Oiwan Kong, mai waihe'e Maui. Noho ia Daniel Pamoaho Kalona McGregor no kalua nui o ahu. Hanau o Daniel Pamoaho McGregor e lua he pula pula. O Daniel Pamoaho McGregor e lua no kalua nui. Noho ia Anita Valerie Branco no laupa hoi hoi. Hanau o Deviana Pomaikai he pula pula. O Deviana Pomaikai no kaiwi ula kapalama o ahu. Noho ia Dean Tiborcio Alegado no San Narciso Zambales, Philippines. No, hanau o Rosie ʻAnolani, pula pula, o wau o Rosie ʻAnolani. O waiale'e o ahu ku'ukulaiwi, o ahu I manu kahalu'u ku'uaina, o kaua po'ai hale ku'u'ua, ku'uwai, o pu'uma eli eli ku'upu'u, o laloa, mahalo. So, today I'm going to be talking to you about principles for Indigenous data governance, and particularly I want to introduce you to a couple of frameworks, but one in particular is the CARES framework, and I will define what that means. And this work I don't do by myself. I also want to recognize that I do this work with Katie Hinson and Sara Kahanamoku at the Ulana ʻIke Center of Excellence with Sea Grant. So thank you for your attention. Before we get started, I would like to have you guys go to menti.com and type in this code 8692-8335 and answer the question, which will really kind of guide some of our discussions today. And the question is, what is data? And as you type, I'm going to change the tab here. So for those of you who can see menti.com, oh, sorry. Don't use the code I just gave you. Use this other code, 13944627. Sorry, that was an old code. And as you type up your answers, it will come up here. So I'm going to give you guys some time to do that. So go to menti.com and it'll be 13944627. And you should be able to type in at least like 3 answers. So if you feel like, and you can just use one word responses too. Okay, here we go. Information, research, insight, plants, knowledge, qualitative, quantitative, important variables. And so it's really cool because the more that the way Menti these word clouds work, right, is the more that people put the same answer, the bigger that word will become. So it seems like a lot of people are really kind of focusing around the word information and knowledge, but insight is coming out, research is something, quantitative. I also see oral history, anything that's gathered, anything that represents, qualitative and quantitative. I like that a lot. Numbers is something that's coming up a lot. Okay, super interesting. All right, we have a lot of information. And I don't know exactly how big of a crowd I have. So Lisa, how many people can I expect to kind of be putting in? Oh, Kilo just popped up and Oli. Oh, this is pretty cool. And you can see like as sometimes the crowd can influence each other and like what people answer changes. So that's really cool. Okay, so from you guys, we got this beautiful answer that it's information. It can be qualitative, quantitative with numbers, statistics, either it's a point of reference, stories, insight, records. The mainstream definition, and this comes from the word data from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is measurements or statistics used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation, as well as modeling. So I think it's really neat. I try to do this with every audience that I give this talk to, and the previous audience that I gave this talk to was in the Data Science Institute at the University of Hawaiʻi Mānoa, and they had a definition that was much more similar to this. But I love that your definition is more varied and diverse. So the next question, and I apologize, go to Menti. I'm going to go to the next question, which is, sorry, let me see if I can, might have screwed this up. Let me see. And let me go to present. Okay, this is the next code. It should kind of like go to the next one. I'm not 100% sure. Oh yeah, that was one, and here's the next one. Who should have access to the data you generate? Everyone. We're doing science for the greater good. Everyone, who you give permission to. Can I just say, this is like a totally different response than from the data scientist. This is so interesting. All would have benefit. Everyone, minorities, who you give permission to. So this is gonna let me scroll down. Depends on permissions. Oh, this is so interesting. The people, the data is being collected. So these are interesting. All who would want to benefit. Okay, but let's take a look. So for the majority, everybody's saying everyone. Ah, okay. See how when we look at the answers and we kind of read the room, we can see that it can sometimes influence what we're thinking. If it's public funding the public, only those with the kuleana to that area to understand the data. The people in the place you study, the community, whoever the data, permission from the community, depends on sensitivity. So it's interesting. Notice the evolution. We started off really broad saying, oh, it should be available for everybody. And then we got much more like, okay, wait, hold up. Let's maybe modify our responses. So do keep that in mind as we continue on. So I'm gonna close this up. Let's see if I can close this up. We'll come back to it. All right. So when we think about data, you saw that there was mainstream data, but there's also indigenous data. And indigenous data is really important, particularly if we're doing research in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, to know what that means. So basically, indigenous data are data. Indigenous data is information. It's also knowledges in any format. So that was really amazing. I saw stories, oral history, quantitative, qualitative, that impacts indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. So it can be data about, I think most people kind of think about, when they think about indigenous data, maybe really straight away go to data about us as individuals. But indigenous data is also data about our non-human relations, land, water, geology, titles, air, soil, sacred ecosystems, territories, plants, animals, microbes, etc. It is, of course, data about us as individuals, our koko, our blood, our DNA, that can be utilized. It's also administrative data, legal data, health data, social, commercial, corporate services, and then it's also data about us as collectives. So it's traditional and cultural information, languages, knowledge systems, ancestral, clan knowledges, etc. Okay, so it's a lot. And the thing is that it's not anything new. Our people, and when I say our people, I don't just mean Kanaka folks, I mean like Kanaka Maoli all over the world, have always been data experts. And the ways that that information has been articulated or codified and passed down, of course, yes, in stories, but have also been in physical kind of things, such as these beautiful totem poles tell stories, these pictographs, which are depicted on animal skin. This is a wampum belt that actually depicts the agreements between tribes, and then other kinds of physical artifacts or belongings to our ancestors have been depicting our knowledge and are therefore part of what we can think of as data. So again, what is Indigenous data? It's information that impacts Indigenous lives at the collective and individual level. And I want to really kind of juxtapose that with how many of us might have been raised, kind of thinking through, right? We have really been trained to think that our data is value free, right? And what I want to do is I want us to have us kind of think or switch our thinking into how knowledge that we generate could actually be held by individuals and by repositories. So when we think about Western science, or some of us might even think of it as settler colonial science, right? It tends to be quantitative. That was one of the key words. Oftentimes, who is collecting that data is very different than when we think about like Indigenous kind of science, right? So usually they're observations made by a small group of professionals who are known as scientists. And one thing that is the type of data is it's called synchronic. And synchronic means that we're looking at data at one point in time. It is often viewed as being objective. That's what I mean by saying it's viewed as being value free. And it's often held by individual entities such as institutions. So we want to contrast that, not just like what is Indigenous data, but how is Indigenous data kind of gotten? Indigenous data can be gotten by settler colonial science and also through Indigenous science practices. You can call it like traditional ecological knowledge. So that can be both qualitative and quantitative. And what I think is one of the bigger defining characteristics between settler colonial Western science and Indigenous science is the observers of that data, we might even call them Hilo, are resource users. So they are specialists in a way, but they're specialists to that resource. They're not a group of professionals whose whole job is just to like walk around making observations. That means that a fisherman is a practitioner of Indigenous scientists, right? A weaver, a hula practitioner who goes into the forest to gather plants and notices what is going on with the cycle of living and growing organisms of Mea Ola. And here's another big difference is not only who is allowed to do science, but the type of science. So Western science is called synchronic, right? Meaning it persists at one point in time. Indigenous science, and I know for sure ʻIke Hawaiʻi kind of stuff, or ʻIke kuʻuna, is diachronic data. And what diachronic data means is that it's over time, over a history. It's what we think of as multi-generational knowledge, that it is knowledge that accretes because we tell stories, we learn from that, we get that knowledge that is passed down. As opposed to, we are only seeing this because we took this data at this one point in time. It is subjective. It makes no bones about being subjective. It is definitely subjective. And importantly, it is knowledge that is held by the collective, the group of those resource users, rather than by the individual, like an institution. So those are some really important differences between scientific practices scientific, different knowledge systems that collect data, although that data that is collected could be indigenous data nevertheless. Okay, so, the beginning of this talk, I said, I'm going to talk about indigenous data sovereignty. So that's why I wanted to break it down. What is data? What is indigenous data? And right now we're going to move into what is sovereignty. So this is from the other thing that I wanted to kind of put some lines around is I'm going to talk about sovereignty from a very United States context. Why? Because we are currently, whether or not you agree with the illegal overthrow or illegal annexation, right now, if you look in your wallet or your passport, it's a United States passport. It's a Hawaii state driver's license. So for that reason, I'm going to talk about it in the United States context. So what is sovereignty? In the case of the United States, a lot of sovereignty towards indigenous people is articulated through tribal sovereignty. So that tribal sovereignty are the rights of recognized tribes to govern themselves. In other words, it's the idea that Native nations are responsible for what happens on their land. And we'll see when it comes to Hawaii, because we don't have federal recognition, that makes it very tricky to figure out, or it might appear on the surface that it's very tricky, but I'll show you that we actually have a lot of laws, even if we don't have federal recognition. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for federal recognition or not, but it does make it tricky in a legal sense to defend indigenous rights for data sovereignty rights for Native Hawaiian folks. Okay, so the bottom line though is when we talk about sovereignty, we are talking about self-determination. And that is the extent to that a nation is able to make and enforce its own rules, resolve disputes, problem solve when rules don't work as well as people might like, and establish its own governing institutions. So now we're going to put these concepts together, indigenous data and sovereignty. And we're talking about the self-determination of Native peoples to control and have the authority over data that is going to impact them, that is about them or about us. Okay, so the mainstream idea, again, let's take out indigenous for a moment, but the mainstream idea of data sovereignty and data governance is the concept that information has been converted, right? We have all this information, we have all this data, maybe you wrote it in a notebook, and then we type it up to put it in a spreadsheet, we digitize it, it's been converted and stored in binary digital form. And when that happens, you may or may not know this, but this is the law. When we do this, it is now subject to the laws in the country in which it was located. And so this is something where it's I just think that's really important for us all to know that. And data governance refers to the ownership, collection, control, analysis, and use of the data. So today we are going to be talking about what is going on with indigenous data sovereignty, and in particular, what are some frameworks when we think about Hawaiian and Native Hawaiian indigenous data sovereignty. Okay, so like I said, this discussion about sovereignty has to be done in the context of the United States because, for better or worse, that's where we are today. And I think it's very clear that US policies have really disempowered indigenous peoples. So I just want to go over some US history briefly to kind of really hit home about why there's some conflict between indigenous data and data sovereignty and indigenous people. So we have basically in the 1800s a whole bunch of laws that justify the United States coming in, taking over, taking land, erasing land-based knowledge, right? Manifest Destiny, Indian Removal Act, the Homestead Act, the General Mining Law, the Dawes Allotment Act. And then in the 1960s, we have the Wilderness Act and the Navajo Hopi Relocation Act. I put that space because that's the space where I want to put in what happened to Hawaii, because Hawaii becomes part of, what happened to the United States. We were an independent sovereign kingdom, independent sovereign nation for 100 years, give or take, 1810, okay, 90 years, 80 years, give or take. And so I wanted to put what happened. So you have the United States, which by and large has this policy of erasure and kind of indigenous genocide. We then, in the middle of this Dawes Allotment Act and all these kind of terrible things, we have the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, We have the annexation of Hawaii to the United States. We have the Organic Act, and we have statehood. And important to note that as a result of this, one of the things that happens is that the military also ends up controlling about 5% of Hawaii's lands. And so what I'm showing you here, these images are from annexation, as well as a result of controlling Hawaii's lands. You have the takeover, for example, of Kaho'olawe, and that's the bombing of Sailor's Camp. Okay, so we have to think about that the idea of asserting indigenous data sovereignty in the United States is a contested space, but nevertheless, we should try and do it. So when we look at indigenous data sovereignty in the United States, the rights of indigenous people in the United States to assert their indigenous data stems from tribal sovereignty that is positioned within federal as well as state recognition. But don't worry, if we don't got that, court cases and treaties. Okay, so again, it's the right then of indigenous people and nations to govern and I say indigenous peoples because not all of the indigenous peoples have nations yet, to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. The logic, just want to be really clear, first of all, derives from inheritance rights to govern our own people's lands and resources. It is further supported by the genesis in traditions, roles, and responsibility for the use of community-held data information. And then it can be further positioned within human rights framework and court cases and treaties or recognition. And then basically what we have as far as like all of this leads us to the fact that the knowledge belongs to the collective and it's fundamental to who we are as indigenous people. So these are kind of the fundamental thinking around indigenous data sovereignty in the United States. Okay, so then let's dive deeper down into Hawaiian knowledge, okay? What I've got here is a whole bunch of examples of Hawaii knowledge that have been kind of appropriation, examples of appropriation that we might be familiar with. So we have here noni pills, maybe you've seen that. Maybe we love some beautiful, I just kind of just did like a best hits off the internet. For Hawaiian Aloha Febreze. What does even Hawaiian Aloha smell like? Let's not forget all of these crazy ho'oponopono chanting videos that are on the internet. They freaking drive me crazy. Aloha poke, when this business tried to copyright the word poke and said we couldn't use the word poke anymore. Individual artists have tried to copyright their work and said, oh yes, this photo that I took means that like I now have copyright over this particular motion. Then we also have our own realm of our own backyard where we have maybe are we going to be cultivating native strains of limu kohu to help cows fart less, which could help impact the climate? Yes, because cows, they really contribute to the methane. And what does this mean? Are any of the benefits for growing this going to come back to native communities? And then in our super own backyard, we have UH doing GMO kalo, right? And so who owns this Hawaiian knowledge? Who are the people who can stand up and say, hey, this is not okay for you guys to do these things? Well, I'm going to show you that even though Hawaiians do not have federal recognition, we have a number of different international as well as state areas that we can lean upon in order to assert our Indigenous rights. So the first is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a lot of words. I'm just going to read the summary. But Article 31 basically states that Indigenous peoples have the right to control, protect, and develop our culture and its associated intellectual property. So in the legal framework, a lot of times things around the areas of data sovereignty are characterized as intellectual property. So this is all of the text there. I want to invite you to go look it up. It's kind of awesome. It includes our science, our technologies, our cultures, our human genetic resources, our seeds, our medicine, our knowledge of flora and fauna. Our oral traditions, literatures, are sports, our games, our visual and performing arts, and we have the right to control, maintain, protect, and develop new stuff. And we should be able to take effective measures to recognize and protect that. Article 27 encourages states to work with Indigenous peoples. And so there's a mandate that says that we shall establish and implement a fair, imprudent, partial, transparent process. Article 21, UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's pretty amazing. I really fully encourage you to go ahead and read it. It provides Indigenous peoples restitution. So this is the ability for us to demand that we be appropriately compensated for Indigenous property, intellectual property taken without free, prior, informed consent, or in violation of traditional laws and customs. In the state of Hawaii, we also have a number of protections. So as I said, we don't have federal recognition, but the state constitution actually protects natural resources and traditional Native Hawaiian rights. And that's where we can derive a lot of our rights through the state constitution. Article 9, Section 1, all public natural resources are held in trust for the benefit of the people. And to protect it, Article 11. Article 12, Section 7 is that the state reaffirms and shall protect all the rights customarily and traditionally exercised for subsistence and cultural religious purposes possessed by Ahupua tenants and Native Hawaiians who were present prior to 1778. Okay, so I kind of gave you all those crazy legal words so that you know that despite the fact that we might not have federal recognition or formalized state recognition as a sovereign people, our rights are affirmed at many different levels of governance. And so because of that, we do have standing as Native Hawaiians to really assert our Indigenous data rights. It becomes a little complicated when we talk about how does that all fit into the university setting. So what I want to show you here is just the history of research. It kind of across the United States and then zooming into Hawaii. And I think this is really important because this is how the sausage is made. This is why when we are kind of like filling out those IRB forms or IACOOK, or if you have to do any of those forms, these are some of the guiding principles that are what we are supposed to do. So I want to start by saying, you know, it's kind of ironic because at the university, we have almost two kind of like tensions. One is we want to be able to kind of like protect the knowledge and say that we have ownership so that, you know, as scientists or researchers, we can be the ones to publish it first. So there's that aspect of wanting to keep data private. But at the same time, there's also this idea of we want data to be free and have everybody share it. So where did those two kind of almost, you could think of them as conflicting ideas come from? Well, over 100 years ago, a company called the Research Corporation, this was a private corporation, was formed to manage university patents. This is universities across the United States. And my alma mater, MIT, became the first university to partner with the Research Corporation. MIT has a very controversial history of patenting and like dealing with like war and weapons development. Anyhow, we'll go on later. But the reason why I say that is then World War II happens and there is a huge increase in federally funded university research because we know that the best and brightest minds are there and they are helping us to develop weapons of war, chemicals of war, to help support our efforts. So federally funded research increases hugely. The NSF budget, the National Science Foundation budget, increases greatly and then even remains elevated because the federal government realized this is one of the greatest mechanisms for innovation for our country. By 1962, over 100 universities have agreements with this research corporation to help to manage the patents that come out of the inventions that they have done. And in fact, not very long later, in 1965, we form our own corporation, our CUH. Many of you are familiar with it. Some of you have been paid by it. Our CUH is a public corporation that is formed to conduct and develop research projects. Many people like our CUH because it's way faster than UH. There's a lot less hurdles. And the research corporations were formed for that exact purpose, to make moving around research monies much easier. And in fact, in 1970, the research corporations start to encourage universities across the nation to assume their own patent duties. In other words, to take control over their own intellectual property. And what that does, sorry, hold on, I have a little bit of cough. What that does is it results in the creation of all these offices of technology transfer. And we have one too. We have the Office of Technology Transfer. Okay, so that's the history, is like, people are like, yo, universities are kind of junk at getting money around. We kind of know this. So let's create these corporations to funnel around money to make research faster. They do that with amazing results. There's all these patents formed. And then, as a result of government claims over university patents, because remember, the government is funding these universities and they want the technology, but the universities are like losing out on all this money that could be had from all the patents. Congress passes what's called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act has a huge impact on research at the university level, because it allows the universities to retain title, meaning even though they get federal funding, they get to retain title to the inventions, and the government retains licenses to use that invention. And that's where we have the beginning of this kind of little bit of conflict between, oh, let's share it with everybody, and oh, let's kind of keep it private for potential public profits in the future. Okay, that's what's happening on the nation, what's happening in Hawaii. Okay, Government Waihe'e asks UH to support some local economic activities, right? Like, we gotta have something other than tourism. So he proposes the Governor's Initiative for Technology Transfer and Economic Development to create a technology transfer office at UH. So even though we're a little bit behind the curve, as usual in Hawaii, we're like 15 years behind. The first ones are in 1970. In 1989, okay, we're like 20 years behind the curve, the Office of Technology Transfer and Economic Development is established. And then what happens is that, and I was at Stanford when this happened, Stanford v. Roche. Roche is a huge pharmaceutical company. The court, Stanford sued Roche Pharmaceuticals, and the court held that inventions belong to their inventors, and that the Bayh-Dole Act does not automatically confer title to federally funded interventions. And as a result, the universities were like, oh, snap, we need to get really much more stringent with our inventors. So that also was a big shift in this whole technology transfer research thing. And you as a researcher might be like, I don't even care about the technology transfer. Nothing that I am ever going to do will ever result in something that's patentable. I don't know. You never know. The Hawaii Business Magazine criticizes ROTTED, lose money because not enough resources. It gets transformed pretty recently into the Office of Innovation and Commercialization. And as usual, the legislature's kind of sandbagging UH and being like, you don't have a lack of clear vision. But yeah, so that's what's going on. So what I want to say is, in this whole timeline of university research, you see what's missing? We have nothing on the books that deals with Indigenous data sovereignty. So the UH has no policies to protect the Indigenous data sovereignty of its Native Hawaiian communities or the communities outside of Hawaii that are Native that we engage in research in. So that's not to say that they're not going to involve in that, but what I will say is it is for us to maybe kind of begin to ask our administration or develop our own, better yet, I think, is we develop from the grassroots and we kind of push up. Okay, so say you're like, wow, yeah, how come we don't have anything, but I want to do something about it? Okay, here are some resources that if you're really interested, I would love for you all to dig into. There are other models for Indigenous data sharing. I'm going to start from the right and go to the left. So the University of Washington has an Indigenous Wellness Institute, and it's a National Center of Excellence. And they actually have data use templates, research templates, code of ethics, and integrity templates that researchers can use and download and then kind of like edit for them to use when they go and they do research in their communities. The Alberta First Nations, that's in Canada, they also have a framework for how to establish data sharing agreements with their communities. More recently, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon, they have some agreements of how to go about it. And guess what? Even in Hawaii, even though it's not at the UH, it's actually led by the community. The community has put forth what's called the Pauakalani Declaration. This was done in response, actually, to the GMO kalo controversy that happened several years ago. And so I want all of you guys to take a look at the Pauakalani Declaration and see how it might apply to your work. So the other place that you can go, and I want to use this as a way to just like give acknowledgement and thanks, is thankfully there is not only, you know, us doing not too much, I don't know, but in Hawaii, but there's a United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and there is a global Indigenous Data Alliance. And so these are some information where you can get this. A lot of the work that is being done, and I've been beginning to work with these organizations too as part of the Ulana ʻIke Center of Excellence. We are collaborators with Dr. Stephanie Russo-Carroll, as well as Andrew Martinez, who have been really, really valuable in helping us begin to think about how do we operationalize some principles here at UH. So now I'm going to talk about, okay, how do we actually do it? All right, so you kind of told you all this crazy stuff about, started with like the overthrow and data and the overthrow, and you're like, oh my God, this is like all over the place. What's going on? Let's get back to like, how do I actually do this in my work? Okay, so the goal is, if we're gonna have data, all of our projects have data. What we really want to do is we want to center Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty. That is the true point of Indigenous data governments. And what we really have to see, the reason why we center Indigenous sovereignty in this is because data is the key to policy. And if we build strong data frameworks, we can build strong nations. And that is the idea, is that nation rebuilding will depend on some good data, and data rebuilding will depend on good governance. And so that really is this interdependence of data and nation building. Okay, so how do we begin to approach this? The first thing is we have to like maybe rethink what is our relationship to data, and what is like just knowing who is even out there and what is their relationship to the data we're collecting. So first of all, I really liked how when we talked about who has access to the data, plenty of people said communities, and we should think of them as rights holders, okay? Rights holders. But there are plenty other people who are involved in this process. And I like how people said if it's publicly funded, it's for the public. So there was this idea of money being granted, okay? We like to consider those as data actors, okay? So we think of Indigenous data sovereignty as a prerequisite for how do we build relationships for good in Indigenous data governance. All of these little crazy, what are they, hexagons I put below are different actors of how we, in the data, like in the lifetime of data, right? So you've collected the data, you're a researcher, you collect it for your universities, right? Universities over here, remember that whole spiel I just told you about? They think they own your IP because you just collected it because you used their funds. You got the funds from NSF, so the granting agency's involved. But then you got to graduate, so you got to publish your paper. So the publishers are also data actors. And oh, because of your funding requirements and the publisher requirements, you have to upload your data to a public repository. So the data repositories, and then potentially other governments if you did your work outside the United States in a different place. So this is the landscape of data actors, and we don't even have the rights holders in this data, but these are the other data actors that you probably didn't even think had an involvement in your data. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce to you, although those are some other principles, what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk are care principles. And the reason why I want to focus on the care principles, which stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, is because these are completely complementary to mainstream data sharing requirements, which is FAIR. You might have already been familiar with the FAIR principles. FAIR data principles are, it has to be findable, it has to be accessible, right? Meaning that's what I mean by it should be open to everybody, but is open to everybody the same as accessible? So think about that. Accessible. I is interoperable, meaning if you changed your, your data system or you got a new computer, you should still be able to access that data. And R is reproducible. So FAIR is kind of the mainstream of data governance right now. Again, FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And what we're saying is when we think about Indigenous data sovereignty, you can be fair and have care. And that's what the care stands for. So collective benefit means that whatever data framework that you're using, we use the word data ecosystem, it should be designed and it should function so that Indigenous peoples can derive benefit from that data. So we need to design it in a way, and we need to think about how that might be. For authority control, we have to recognize, and again, that's where all of my slides on governance came in. Indigenous peoples have the rights and interests to Indigenous data. I just proved to you many slides back all of the receipts on why that is and how that is. And they have to be recognized, and their authority to control the data also has to be recognized. Then there's responsibility, the responsibility of those of us researchers who are working. Those of us who are working with Indigenous data, we have to share how those data are going to be used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And ethics. The rights and the well-being of Indigenous people should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle. Data life cycle meaning we collected the data, we analyzed the data, we're going to upload that data, right, for the purposes of publication, and then what happens in the long term? Who's going to continue to have access to that data? Okay, so a lot of this can also be, this can be like, oh my God, so many words, just give it to me more simple. It can also be distilled as the 5 A's, which is authority. You saw authority here. See? Access, authorship, attribution, and acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is at the bottom. It's the bare minimum. Like, thank you for letting us come to your community, right? Attribution is more than just acknowledgement. Actually, this person is the one who helped me collect the data. Authorship is actually listing people on your paper who as co-authors or on your poster. Access is they can actually go in and get that data for themselves. Authority is they have the right to control that. So this is kind of like the ladder of engagement and participation. So, okay, again, you're like, oh my God, but like, just how do I do it? So here's some tips, the top 6 tips to promote Indigenous data sovereignty. Just recognize and promoting sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. That will be really, that's the first thing. Center Indigenous values when you're working with Indigenous communities. That can be really difficult when we are working under constraints of our grants, wanting to graduate, right? To take the time, do things in the appropriate way. Also remember to conduct scholarship in service to community and support community-driven research, not just our own. Maybe our own is community-driven, hopefully. But be sure to share and build research or development capacity within those communities. Use existing data governance protocols and procedures. If they already have a way that they want it to be done, don't go make them reinvent the wheel. Just go with the flow and do what they do. And another important thing is to support Indigenous scholars. whether or not they're in these communities already or in the academy. Remember what we talked about, what is science and how different kind of knowledge systems really acknowledge different ways of who is allowed or who is considered a scientist or who can collect information, including community members, Indigenous scholars in the decision-making process as co-authors and as grant reviewers can be really, really important. Okay, but I get you might even want to be like, okay, no, but like really for real, what do you mean? Okay, so let's start with the C, collective benefit. What do I mean research benefits community? Okay, so before you start, this is like you're going through the table. Explain and demonstrate how your research and potential results are relevant and have value. Okay, but I also think it's important if you know what the harms are to be aware and let the people know about the harms. Don't only be Pollyanna and be like, oh, it's gonna be all good, don't worry. The data has to be grounded in community values, aspirations, and well-being. So when you're developing how you are going to be organizing your data, use Indigenous data classification schemes, use analysis frameworks. It doesn't even have to be like, oh, I'm going to use Kaulana Mahina because it's Hawaiian. Use whatever is useful to that community. It can be a Hawaiian concept, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an Olelo Hawai'i, right? To be relevant. Data for self-determined development. So you want to collect and code the categories so that communities and individuals can define it the way that is important to them. So that if they choose to limit who can see the data, that's how you're self-determining that data development. Okay, the communities are going to define that. And what does that come up to? It's just like an additional meta label. It's like an additional category. If you're like having your crazy categories in your data tables, you can have your Indigenous label, so that they can manipulate the data that they might want to, so that they can disaggregate the data that they want to look at. This is especially true in large data sets. Compensate your local experts. Compensation can be through paying. Compensation can be through like sharing resources. It doesn't only have to be money, but money really helps. Oops, wrong way. Okay, authority to control. What does that mean? It means that if you're going to recognize Indigenous people's rights and interests, it means you want to establish institutional protocols for this. Now, this might not be in your ability to control as a graduate student at UH right now. It's something that I'm actively working on in our center, is to be like, hello, UH, what are we doing? Can we have some institutional principles? Data find place of learning. Anyhow, yeah. So you want to recognize the rights of Indigenous people to free, prior, and informed consent. And what that means is you want to make sure that the data use it comes with consent. If it's federally funded and it has to be made public, does your community know that? Do they have the ability to say, no, we don't want all of our data to be made public. I know you got this grant. We don't feel comfortable. Try and find, what are you going to do then? You've got to find private monies then, or some other way, if you want that research to be done. The data has to be able to have access to the data in a usable form. Maybe you want to return that to the communities. Maybe you're returning samples to the communities, returning water. My group collects water, and we have returned water. We've returned sediment to the communities where we collected, because that's Vai and Aina. And then enact those protocols. Ensure community control and ownership of those data. Okay, responsibility. Again, you want to expand and make opportunities through even the way that you do the research, participatory methodologies. How are you making your planning and your design? How are you recording it? Use the biocultural labels. There is this group called Local Context, which has created these online web portals to kind of like help empower communities as well as researchers to create these metadata labels. Data generating resources for languages. Use the languages of Indigenous peoples. I think that's so important. By doing that, you affirm their worldview. And when you add this meta label, you can add something like open, meaning it can be used for everybody. It could be need to use only with permission. It could be, you know, you can, by adding this additional meta label, it's just one category, but it establishes provenance of that data, and the meta label will follow that piece of data in no matter what database you're in. It's something that's very small but really powerful. Of course, what are you actually doing the research on? Conducting the research that is consent driven and inclusive and really matters to those people. Ethics, I actually teach a whole nother kind of, I could like go on and on about the ethics, but you really want to again use the Indigenous ethical frameworks, not just the data or knowledge frameworks, but the ethical frameworks. What's a community defined review process so that communities can have the agency to say yes or no. For example, in community advisory boards, it's really important that researchers explain what is the benefit to communities. Oftentimes, researchers haven't even thought about what the benefit to the community is. They just only think about the benefit to their science. So it's a good exercise for researchers to go through. And what's the community-defined code of conduct? And is it like, what is the mechanism to minimize any harms and is there a way to have like ongoing and iterative consent? And then finally, what about secondary use? This is really huge. How can the data governance structure account for potential future use? Because what happens now is a whole bunch of people can mine that data, not even have even been to that community, and pull out really interesting information, maybe even data that the researchers didn't even realize that they had. I'll just give you one example before I open it up, because I've been talking a long time. I work on microbes in the water. So say you were doing a microbiome, like a human microbiome study, where you were collecting people's fecal matter to find out like, what are they eating? How is their health, their diet impacting their health? And you tell the native community you're working with, it's all good. We're only collecting microbial data. The problem with that is, in the basic functioning of our human intestinal tract, microbes are not the only things coming out. Food is coming out. So sure, you're going to get a signal on what that person ate. But the person's individual human DNA is also being secreted and coming through. And so somebody could come through and use that microbiome data and do a secondary data dive and look at the human DNA that was co-extracted, just because when you extract DNA, you're extracting everything. So they can come in secondarily in a totally separate study, never even ask permission from the community, and they can pull the human DNA that is associated with the poop. Sounds crazy, and it has totally happened before. So this is what I mean by your data governance frameworks have to account for potential future use, and you need to be totally open with your communities about what else could this data be used for. Another example would be, say they're doing GIS of fishing areas in Miloli'i. Okay, we all know Miloli'i is a very, very important fishing village. Should the GPS coordinates be attached to that data? And what would happen if that data went public and then commercial fishers came in and went fishing in Miloli'i? Yeah, there's a CBFSA, but yeah, maybe they're not going to be paying attention to that. So that is the kind of community concern you have to have, is who else might be able to have access to that data and what might those data be used for. Okay, I've been talking a long time. And I did want to say, this is all a part of some long-term work that I've been a part of called the Kulana Noi'i. And Kulana means what is your stance, your attitude, your posture, and Noi'i means research. So I've developed, working for a long, long time with a lot of community members and nonprofit groups, a process for how can we begin to, data governance is just one piece of the whole pie that encompasses our relationships with communities when we're doing research. It's a super important piece that until now has been kind of not really looked at. And we got to look at it more in the future, but it's just one piece. And so I've been working a lot on how we develop kind of like research standards and research stances around just and equitable research. But I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but you can Google this. and find the document if you're curious. Just want to say, whatever you're going to do when you do research with communities, just remember it's not a compliance standard or a checklist. That's not going to get you to where you need to be. You know, you got to really work on ideas, values, and behaviors, and really flip that switch from being transactional to being relational in your interactions with your community partners, if you really want to have just and generative relationships. In the Kulana Nui'i, we do ask some of these questions. So I just wanted to end with that, is that these are the questions that we have like really developed for that section. What are the values related to knowledge stewardship? What's the process and timeline that researchers and community members can access data? What information might be most useful? And remember that this might be different across different segments of the community. Not everybody can have the same answer. And you can see that the questions that we put into our Kulana Nui'i regarding knowledge stewardship are very similar to the same questions that you have to apply in the CARES principles. The one I really want to dig into is make sure you know, so you can inform your community, what are the institutional clauses, policies, or agreements related to data ownership and access that might apply to this project. Specifically, you should be maka'ala and aware of the federal funding requirements that data needed to be shared publicly, or the academic institutional policies that award the institution intellectual property rights for research conducted not only by faculty, but by students as well. So I want you guys to go and do your homework. So if you're doing research in these communities, they understand where the rights lie. Okay, all right. So I just wanted to end with if you're ono for some more information, you can go look up Kulana Nui'i. You can also reach me. But I do want to say that UH has extremely limited capacity to protect sensitive Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data sovereignty. Right now, it really is on us. One of the projects that I'm taking up is to identify and address these barriers to co-production. And I'm working with our Hawaii EPSCoR for this round. It's called Change Hawaii, to create curriculum and practices for operationalizing the CARE principles. And I'm also a participant in the Earth Data Relations Working Group, which has to do with a lot of our environmental sampling. And I'm also open for any ideas that you guys have. So with that, mahalo. Any questions?
We are here. We're at the hour, so I'm wondering, you can stay for questions, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Are there any questions from our studio audience? You guys are good? Okay, Zoomers, do we have any questions on the Zoom audience? Oh, you have a question, River?
Okay.
Okay, so Andrew, take it away.
Okay, how do I word this? So like since UH has extremely limited protection for Indigenous knowledge, so like if we're gonna do some work with, you know, like say at a Hawaiian fish pond or something like that, is it ever like, how do we protect ourselves, or is it maybe sometimes like it's not the right place to do research as a student, and like I don't know if that makes sense.
That's a really good question. I myself do a lot of research at a Hawaiian fish pond, and what I am very clear on, so I do a couple things. First of all, when I start doing the research, I meet with them several times. I meet with them at least once a month. And when I say meet, it can also be something super simple, like we send lots of text messages, I stop and check in. So we have an iterative process. I work with them on the questions that are important to them. They help me co-design the experiments, like when should I go, who should I go with. Even sometimes their staff will help me actually do the research. They are co-authors in every single thing that I publish. And I make it very clear because I'm often approached, because I have a very long time series of data. I'm often approached to be like, hey, can you share your data? And what I say is, this is not my data. This data belongs to He'ia Fish Pond. And I don't even mean Paipai o He'ia, the stewards. We all agreed together, and that was something we did pretty early on in the beginning, that this data is for this place. As the stewards of this place, Paipai definitely does have a huge say in whether or not I'm allowed to share it. And so I just involve any time that people ask me to share data, I very much ask the fish pond first. We have a shared secure drive that I put data from every single student that I have. My students understand we have an exit checklist, as most PIs do when you're, hopefully when you leave the lab, like, show me where all your samples are. As part of that, they need to format their data in a very specific way that we've developed with the fish pond and upload it to that folder. So the fish pond practitioners who have access, they can go and look anytime. That it includes things like PowerPoint presentations of their data, so that if the fish pond practitioners ever want to use that for themselves to write grants, they totally can just go and take whatever we have produced for them. If the fish pond practitioners want us to make a certain graph for them, we will make a certain graph for them. So I think it's possible to have, and me saying that also, I totally mess up all the time. We have lots of miscommunication. But I think we have a level of trust that we're all working towards a similar goal, which is to bring the fish pond back to full abundance. Yeah, so I do have a question. Lisa, are these folks, the people who've logged in, is there going to be a way I can share my slides with them? They've dropped their email addresses, but I don't know how to, can we save the chat?
Yeah, I'll save the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll save it and send it to you. And then the students, we just upload it for the students in the class on the course leveling. Okay, are there
great.
any more questions? Okay, River, take it away.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So in your career, have you experienced like a situation where maybe a colleague is kind of unaware of how they're perpetuating like outdated and negative ideas about research connected to Indigenous peoples, or being ignorant to the principles that they themselves have articulated is important to adhere to when working in their spaces? And how did you deal with that?
The answer is yes. One of the responses was to develop the kulana noi'i, so I work at He'ia Fish Pond, and lots of people do their work there, and colleagues in my own department were being pretty extractive to the practitioners of the fish pond, and so we developed this and invited them to participate in the making of this so that they could understand. And it wasn't a matter of like calling them out or shaming them, so I'm not going to name names, but in that particular instance, it was calling in people and saying, we want to empower the fish pond, and the work that you're doing is really important. I mean, that's the approach that I have been taking, which is to say, your work is important. And you know that because you're doing the work and you think it's awesome. We need to make sure that the work that we're doing is beneficial. And I try not to, that's not true, but I try not to call people out as best as possible. And I try to focus on the positive as much as possible, invite people into the space. When there is very egregious things happening, I will go to the administration and make known what I know. And that has happened as well. Yeah, I mean, I think me having tenure right now, I do have the benefit of that. When I was an assistant professor, I recognize that power dynamic is like a super real thing, especially if you are a graduate student. I've also acted on behalf of people who felt like they were unable to make publicly known. And so if that is something that is happening to you, or that something that you have experienced, please feel free to email me. My inbox is crazy, but I will get back to you eventually. Yeah, there isn't currently, other than the ombudsman, a really good pathway for making exposed this kind of thing. And so I do try to work it through relationships and people that I know who know folks, and I just let it be known, like, hey, what's going on with so and so. But I do use my position now as being a tenured professor to try and exert more leverage on people. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
It's
Anyone else?
not easy. It's not easy. I will tell you that. It's not easy. It's very difficult. And oftentimes folks are not wholly aware of the negativeness that the harms that they're perpetuating. So it's best to try and bring it to them with generosity, if possible, to invite them in, as opposed to calling them out. They'll be much more responsive that way, even though it might be like, oh my God, so eras, but yeah, you can't yell at everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. So I think we're good with questions. We just really want to shout out and say thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. And for everybody, we'll make the slides available to everyone. And just thank you again, Rosie. Really, it's fantastic talk. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Mahalo.
Mahalo.